Welcome back. You're still watching the Daily Debate, and I am honored to be having with me over on the studio for today Dr. Mohamed Abdel Halim, the political analyst, to be shedding more light on the participation of His Excellency President Abdel al-Sisi in the G20 summit. Dr. Mohamed, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime. First of all, how do you see the participation of His Excellency President Abdel al-Sisi in the G20 summit? Of course, upon an invitation by the Indian Prime Minister, or the host of the summit for this year in New Delhi, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. What is the significance of inviting Egypt to such an important summit?
Yeah, the sort of the history that does exist between Egypt on the one hand and India on the other is very much deeply rooted one indeed. This is not supposed to be the first visit for His Own Excellency, Mr. President of Sisi. For about 6 months ago, I mean, there was a couple of visits actually. The first was on the part of Narendra Modi, actually, the Indian Prime Minister.
Yes.
And the second was when Mr. President of Sisi was being invited also in like manner as a guest of honor actually to attend the celebration of the National Day of India. That was about 6 months ago actually. So, I mean, to begin with, the sort of the relationship between both Egypt and India is very much firmly tied and very much strong, actually, culturally, military, and actually even socially. To a greater extent, this 18th session, actually, on the part of the G20 summit, would seem to be quite significant and very much different from the previous summits, actually, insofar as the previous ones actually were trying every now and again to reconcile the two struggling parties, that is Russia on the one hand and Ukraine on the other, to no avail. Actually, that was the last year. But that sort of visit would come in a very particular strategic moment in the history of almost the whole world, in which the, the struggling parties are very much maximized. The sorts of the coup d'etat in Africa is very much, prevalent, in much same way that, the food scarcity, as much as the lack of energy and attempts on the part of His Own Excellency during the previous COP27 summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, that is last November, would inaugurate the first initial and the first inaugurative, actually, step towards harmonizing the human beings with the external world around them, actually. That is the sort of, the propagating of the utilization of the oxygen, the hydrogen, the green energy, and finding alternatives and substitutes actually for the traditional types of fuel, that is the fossil fuels, gas and oil, would seem to be quite to a great extent polluting the whole world around us actually. So I think that this sort of visit on the part of His Own Excellency, Mr. President of Sisi, would seem to be quite occupying a very special significance, insofar as it would seem to be in somehow or another continuation of the previous step that had been taken a year ago, that was the COP27, the sort of the very much successful summit, on which almost all the parties and all the world and the Western world did attend, yes, including the President of the American administration, Joe Biden, actually bestowing Egypt about $5,000 million actually for establishing a sort of a monetary fund for clarifying the beaches and the shores and finding alternatives and substitutes for the traditional sort of the fossil fuel. Again, that sort of visit on the part of His Own Excellency, particularly at this particular stage in the sort of the relationship that does exist between India and between Egypt on the other, would occupy a very strong significance insofar as it seems to be quite not halting still, not standing still,
yes,
not just a mere, friendly relations.
They're
and
developing.
Cultural, but actually, very much maximized to the extent of being nowadays a sort of a strategic partnership actually between two parties.
Yes.
And I think that Prime Minister Modi actually is very much interested in the policies, the political actions and reactions on the part of His Own Excellency Mr. Fattah Sisi in, bridging the Gulf and a large number of problematic situations in Africa, particularly the sort of the continent that would occupy pride of place among all the examinations and discussions and the themes that had been discussed during the previous 2 days, actually. One of the major topics, actually, that His Own Excellency is very much interested to tackle in details is finding, as I've just said, a substitution for the traditional source of fuel and energy, in addition to the fact that he's very much concerned with drawing the attention of the international community towards one main fundamental problematic issue concerning Africa, which is alleviating the debts and or minimizing the sort of the sanctions and the debts that would have to be paid. And representing, perhaps, I think that His Own Excellency was supposed to be the first, courageous leader in the Middle East, actually, to tackle that sort of thing. Yes. That Africa is a blameless continent, that it has nothing to do, actually, with the external pollution and the sort of contamination, actually, that would seem to be surrounding us here, there, and everywhere. And initiating, in the meantime, what you might call the culpability or the responsibility on the part of the Western world as being the culpable one, actually, who would seem to pay for it at the end of the day. Particularly drawing the attention, not only the international community, but actually the Arab world, including the African countries, actually, to the cause and the devastating aspects of pollution besieging the African continent, not as stemming out from within, but from without, owing to the, several industrializations and industrial revolutions on the part of the Western countries that were utilizing their own existential power, actually, here, there, and everywhere, representing their own sense of supremacy and their own extreme sense of superiority, actually, by utilizing atomic power and, using and utilizing the raw materials, the diamonds, and the resources and the natural treasures, actually, of Africa to a greater extent, depriving those poor people of their own simple rights to practice their own daily routines, actually, as much as any sort of individual human being would or did, actually, in Europe. That's why that sort of point is very much important, because it would not only emanate and liberate, the African people, actually, of the shackles and the fetters of the past, of the imperial and colonial powers, actually represented by, either the American administration or even the Western world, but in the meantime would draw their own attention to their own simple right to say yes and no, actually, to be liberated, actually, to be able to utilize their own natural resources again. And in the meantime, representing that they are blameless figures, that I just said, that the only figures, that the only people who would have to pay for it at the end of the day is the Western world, because of their own superiority, as I've just said, of contaminating almost the external and eternal atmospheres of Africa. This is another main point that His Own Excellency is very much, keeping an eye on and very much keen to represent for the external world. And in the meantime, he was drawing their own attention to the fact that if we would have to live peacefully, side by side with each other together, if you would have to be very much eliminating the external dangers and the sense of the illegal immigration, actually, you would have to be very much active, representing and stretching, in the meantime, a sort of a helping hand, actually, for the poor African figures and fellows, actually, to try to establish factories for those people, actually, to find a sort of a job to be in, to try to solve the problem of the masked unemployment, and actually to fill the gap of their own everyday routine by something very much significant, to be at the end of the day something rather than being nothing. This is another major theme that His Own Excellency is very much keeping an eye on, and I think that his own address in today's word and yesterday's word was very much successful in representing the sort of the active role and very much powerful, turn on the part of the Egyptian presidency during the COP27 and drawing the attention of almost the whole world. And perhaps, as I've just said, he was commonly regarded the first courageous Arab leader, actually, to draw the attention of the world, of the external world, for their own culpability for almost all these details for the first time. And I think that they would have to keep an eye on it. And they did endorse the fact that almost all the addresses and all the speeches and all the significant remarks that had been highlighted actually by His Own Excellency in his own address in today, as much as in his own word with other ministers and prime ministers, and that sort of very much significant and international summit. To a greater extent, it was very much minimized. Starting in 1999 with 7 countries actually very much attempting to solve the problems and the issues and deterring facts of almost all these, what you might call the third world countries and the African world and the African continent. The sort of the black country or the black continent actually, was so called actually at one time. I think now that that sort of inaugurative address and that sort of very much significant visit on His Own Excellency's part actually to the G20, which is very much being endorsed and recognized widely, and in the meantime inviting the African Union to be as a perpetual member actually, so much so that hopefully the next year we would seem to be quite calling not the G20 but the G21 actually, hopefully so.
Yes, Doctor, you mentioned the African continent and the statements made by His Excellency President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and he mentioned in the latest sessions of the G20 summit that there is a technological gap between Africa and the rest of the world, or maybe the richer countries as well. How can we be mitigating the differences between the richer countries and the poorer nations? Because technology is going through everything nowadays, starting from agriculture, industry, communication, everything now.
Yeah, I mean, he was very much suggested and very much sage enough actually, and also drawing the attention of almost all these Western countries to one also main fundamental detail, which is the sort of the wide gap between Africa on the one hand and the Western world on the other. As I've just said, the biological divergences and the differences actually, and the extreme sense of resourcefulness and the resources and the natural sources and resources are wide expansion of seas and beaches actually, of animals, of raw materials, of diamonds, of rubies, and of these very much remunerative mines actually could be regarded as in themselves a sort of very helping hand actually that would help those own people. But because of long years of colonialism and imperialism, because of colonializing actually a large number of almost all these countries, the theme of isolation and alienation was being part and parcel of their own daily routine, to the extent that they were being deprived, as I've just said, of their own simple rights of practicing their own legal activities, of selecting and rejecting what sort of leader that they will have to be dealing with, and selecting or rejecting him, in any conceivable respect. And in the meantime, depriving them of a large number of democratic practices, actually, the sort of the thing that would leave them very much lagging behind, quite unable to decide and to say yes or no, actually. That sort of cultural gap, in addition to the sweeping devastation of ignorance and illiteracy, their own inability of practicing their own democratic simple rights in everyday routine and everyday life, came to be regarded as a sort of a circle of danger that is narrowing and narrowing till it would reach their own necks at the end of the day, leaving them very much deprived of almost all their own, simple needs. And as such, this is one thing that the Western world would utilize in stretching their own powerful hand, of utilizing their own natural resources, and of exploiting actually all their own daily routine activities actually, to the extent that they would seem to be quite motionless and still unable to decide even to say yes or no. And as such, that was something significant for the Western world. But I think now almost all the world would seem to be quite drawing their own attention to the African continent. We still remember during the last 6 months actually, we have had the African American summit, the Russian African summit, and we have the Chinese as well. We have had the Silk Road and the Belt and the Road and all these attempts on the part of the Western world to be in rather than to be out. And their own ability actually in utilizing all these things and to get into the heart of the darkness actually of that sort of dark African continent actually would never ever actually be pacified or facilitated actually had it not been negotiating with Egypt, because it seems to be quite the right and the very much straightforward gate to get into almost all these countries. That's why the existence of Egypt is very much existential. It's very much pivotal actually. And I think that America, Russia and China and almost all the other superpowers actually would find in His Own Excellency, Mr. President Fattah al-Sisi, a good negotiator, a sort of a leader who would seem to be quite able to pacify and to calm down and to put an end for almost all the troubles that had been there for quite a long period of time. And we did strike a very good example in 2019, the sort of the period in which Egypt was playing the role of our chairmanship actually of the African Union. We have had a great deal of very much strategic steps towards bringing together two different separate pacifying the sort of the countries that were not on good terms with each other, and in the meantime helping paving the way for the advance of the very much successful summit of the COP27 with its own widespread moral lessons and didactic details that would seem to be quite very much striking good examples for the Western world of how Egypt would always be there in the interests of almost not only the Mediterranean people, but actually in the interests of almost all concerned, including the American administration as much as the European Western world as well.
Yes, we have seen today the conclusion of the G20 summit by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and passing the gavel to the or the next summit, which will be held in Brazil. India and Brazil are two countries members of the BRICS, which was inviting Egypt to be a member of the BRICS starting from next year. So how do you see the importance of Egypt joining the BRICS in terms of having a bigger stature when it comes to be invited to the G20 summit for next year as well?
One of the major, very much beneficial lessons and outcomes that would come out actually of the G20 is the invitation of Egypt actually to be part and parcel of the BRICS.
Yes.
The determining economic fact as much as strategic opportunity to be spread here, there and everywhere. Because between politics and between economics, there is a very slight thin gap actually, both of which would seem to be quite identifying and representing and continuing each other. The act of selecting Egypt to be part and parcel of the BRICS is another master stroke on the part of His Own Excellency actually to represent that. Egypt is not only to be a superior in dealing with diplomatic relations and political issues, not only in the field of diplomacy, not only in the field of the military power, but actually initiating and giving a helping hand actually in the economic issues to a greater extent, because the BRICS as it stands actually would seem to be quite a sort of an affiliation of the G20, and the act of selecting Egypt as it stands actually would be striking a very good example of how very much beneficial the opportunities that are to be left on the road for the Egyptian presidency actually would seem to be quite very much helping every now and again to work in the interests and of the welfare of almost all the Egyptians. So, strategically, culturally, economically, and socially, in the meantime, Egypt would always to be there, taking very much integrated steps, actually, participating in all these international communities and blocs, actually, striking a very good example of how a Mediterranean country, very much situated at the heart of the Arab world, would seem to be quite able to say its own say, whenever it would like to say it, the way of saying it, very much peacefully, without intervening, actually, into the affairs of almost all the other adjacent countries, whether these countries may be Arab or Western world, actually. The whole thing is very much important because in the meantime, it would clarify and underline the significant portrait of Egypt in the eyes of the West as very much peaceful country that is able to take a decision, actually, in the right time and in the right place. And that sort of thing is very much important as being testified and very much illustrated by, His Own Excellency's calling for letting and giving Egypt the opportunity to be the world's largest basket for grains at the wake of the Russian-Ukrainian war,
yes.
And the shortage of food. and after the devastation of the Kerm Bridge, actually, on the part of Ukrainian troops, and the retaliation on the part of the Russian army, actually, of demolishing, of devastating the vessels of grains that were to be directed, actually, towards the Middle East, a sort of a thing that would make the United States of America play a very dangerous role of defaming the reputation of Russia. I think Russia would try in somehow or another to benefit from the situation, to lift the sanctions, and to be very much acting in a very much a strategic way, particularly with the Egyptian presidency, particularly when I would say that even also Russia would have its own way of getting into the heart of Africa, just side by side with China, despite the fact that Vladimir Putin and China did not attend the G20, but actually their own agents are there practicing and dictating their own orders and rules, actually, and of representing their own sense of supremacy. And I think, Egypt as it stands and playing the role of the forum of the gas in the Mediterranean era and the Mediterranean part, being representing its own existential power and strategic role, and playing the role of the supreme controller of almost all the actions of the Arab world at this particular stage in the history of the, the diplomatic relations in a world that seems to be quite ferociously changing with that sort of high speed, actually. And in the meantime, the assumption of its own strategic role of being highly invited as a guest of honor, as a very much active participant, as a sort of supreme controller of almost all the actions of the external world, would be very much striking a good example of how pivotal the role of Egypt is in the Middle East during these, days, I would say.
Yes, Doctor, we will be heading to the other report of the daily debate for tonight, which focuses on the Egyptian exports to the G20 countries, which had surged by 21.1% in the past period to be reaching 25.6 billion American dollars. All this and more in the upcoming report, so stay tuned.
The value of Egyptian exports to the G20 countries increased to record $25.6 billion in 2022, compared to $21.1 billion in 2021, an increase of 21.1%, while the value of Egyptian imports from the G20 countries reached $62.5 billion compared to $58.9 billion during the comparative years, an increase of 6.1%. Data from the Central Agency for Public Mobilization and Statistics showed an increase in the value of trade exchange between Egypt and the G20 countries, reaching $88.1 billion in 2022 compared to $80 billion in 2021, increased rate of 10.1%. Turkey came at the top of the list of the top 10 G20 countries importing from Egypt during 2022, with a value of $4 billion. Italy came in second place with a value of $3.4 billion, then Saudi Arabia, then the United States with a value of $2.3 billion. China topped the list of the top 10 G20 countries exporting to Egypt during 2022 with a value of $14.4 billion. Saudi Arabia came in second place with a value of $7.9 billion, then the United States with a value of $6.8 billion, then Russia with a value of $4.1 billion, then India with a value of $4.1 billion, then Germany with a value of $4 billion, then Turkey with a value of $3.7 billion. The value of investments of the G20 countries in Egypt amounted to $24 billion during the fiscal year 2021-2022, compared to $21.2 billion during the fiscal year 2020-2021. Saudi Arabia ranked first in the list of the top 10 G20 countries investing in Egypt during the fiscal year 2021-2022 with investments worth $8.5 billion. The value of remittances from Egyptians working in G20 countries recorded $14.3 billion during the fiscal year 2021-2022 compared to $13.9 billion during the fiscal year 2020-2021, an increase of 2.9%.
Welcome back. You're still watching the Daily Debate. Dr. Mohamed Abdel Halim, the political analyst. As we did see in the past report, the exports of Egypt has surged to the G20 countries by about 21.1% to be reaching 25.6 billion American dollars. How do you think the step of joining the BRICS as well could be even increasing the amount of exports to the BRICS countries or the trade exchange between the BRICS countries as a whole and the G20 countries as well?
Right. Apart from the strategic partnership and the cultural relations, and we wouldn't have to forget that all these blocks and all these entities actually are very much economic and real essence, actually right from its own early start. All those people would come together, sit and talk and examine and discuss almost all these financial details with the view of, not only culturally being very much mixed with each other, but
yes,
in like manner, actually, to try to exchange the materialistic benefit. It is in somehow or another a sort of keeping an eye on the materialistic needs for each single individual country, not only in the G20, but also in the BRICS, that they are actually, each single individual country would get into that sort of block or entity with an eye on maximizing their own economic benefit, actually, and surging actually to a great extent to reach to a sort of a very much phenomenal figure. And this is not very much exceptional or bizarre, because it's as Winston Churchill did put it at one time, actually, that within the world of politics there isn't that sort of sentimental, emotional feelings, nor even an extreme sense of hatred. Neither extreme sense of hatred nor supreme sort of loving kindness, just mutual interests and mutual identifications and mutual benefits actually between these and that. And this is the language of today's terminology, actually, that each single individual sort of country within that sort of entity would keep an eye on right from the early start.
Yes, Dr. Mohamed Abdel Halim, the political analyst. Thank you very much for being with us tonight on the Daily Debate.
My pleasure, sir.
Anytime. And this brings us to the end of the Daily Debate for tonight, as we focused on the participation of His Excellency President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in the G20 summit, which was held in India, more specifically in New Delhi, as the upcoming summit will be held as well in Brazil, according to the steps that were taken today between the Indian Prime Minister and the Brazilian President Lula Inácio da Silva. And we will be hoping for more trade exchange and economic and political benefits as well between Egypt and the BRICS countries and the G20 countries in the near future. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.